Okay, as I mentioned, you have about 60,000 miles of blood vessels. Most of them are capillaries. This is a picture that is showing you exactly how many capillaries you have in the body. Pretty damn interesting. I don't know if any of you guys saw the Bodies or Body Worlds exhibits. Those are fantastic, and they do a technique called plastination, and there's a special type when they preserve the vessels. So capillaries are again microscopic, and this is a capillary in a longitudinal section with white blood cells and platelets going through it. So you can see the simple squamous epithelial cells here, yeah? And you can also see that the capillary is not much wider than the red blood cells that are going through it. Okay, so not all capillaries are the same, though. There are different degrees of permeability and capillaries, so let's look at them. So these go from least permeable to most permeable as you move to this side, and they are called continuous, fenestrated, and sinusoid capillaries. So let's talk about each one of them. The ones that have tight junctions between the epithelial cells, endothelial cells, which is just a type of simple squamous epithelial cells, they are pretty tight. They have tight junctions most places. It is not very easy for substances to get from the bloodstream into the tissue around it without going through the cells. So it's not easy for the solutes to make it through between the cells. So these are the least permeable. But of the continuous capillaries, there is a less permeable type of these, which is the ones that make up the blood-brain barrier. And the ones that make up the blood-brain barrier have tight junctions everywhere, and they are really, really tight. They are called continuous complete tight junctions. And anything that gets out of a capillary into central nervous system tissue pretty much has to ask permission by going through a cell, not between a cell. So it's like the tightest of tight capillaries, the continuous complete tight capillary. So the places that you find continuous capillaries, brain has the tightest ones, but then there's also continuous capillaries in the dermis and also in your muscles. And then the next one, they get a little bit more permeable. And these are called fenestrated capillaries. And what the fenestrated capillaries have is not as many tight junctions. And then the walls of the epithelial cells actually have fenestrations. And a fenestration is kind of like a hole. Fenestra means hole. Really what it is the epithelial cell right there pushes everything but 2 layers of cell membrane out. So it's like a double paned piece of glass, but still it's very thin because there's no organelles between the panes of the window, and there's very little intracellular fluid. So it increases transport in those. So you find those in locations where lots of exchange occurs, like in the kidneys and in the epithelial tissues just behind the intestine for absorption. And then the most permeable ones are called sinusoid capillaries, and the sinusoid capillaries are very wide, very leaky capillaries. So being a bit larger lumen will slow the blood down a little bit, and then in addition they're also super curvy, which also slows the blood down. So it's going to be slow. It's going to kind of lumber through this capillary. It's also going to be leaky because there's hardly any tight junctions to speak of, and even the basement membrane is fragmented. These sinusoid capillaries often have big macrophages, like white blood cells, that are like outside the sinusoid capillary. So you find these like in the liver and the spleen, and as something funky goes through the sinusoid capillaries in the liver, you can see a big macrophage looking down, and it's like, oh, you're a pathogen, and scooping it up out of there. So you find these in the liver and the spleen, also in the bone marrow, and in some of your lymph nodes. Okay? All right, so now let's just talk briefly about what a venule is. and then we'll talk about veins. So what is a venule? A venule is kind of the vein equivalent of an arteriole. They're usually super variable in people and not consistent enough to name. You can sometimes see them with the naked eye and sometimes not. They are pretty much just a really small vein. But remember, now we are on our way back to the heart. So we went through all of these arteries, arterioles, capillaries. Now we're on our way back. So we're going to go back to having the same tunics that we had before. But remember, in a vein, the need for elasticity is not what it was in an artery. And why is that? Well, it's way further away from the pump, yeah? But in addition, you also lost fluid as you went through the capillary bed, right? And veins tend to be larger lumen. So all three of those things means the vein is going to be lower pressure than an artery. And there's also one more reason I'll tell you in just a second. So veins, big picture. Let's just go to veins, big picture. These are carrying blood back toward the heart. Just all of them are carrying blood back toward the heart. And there are more veins than there are arteries. And that will slow down the blood flow in the venous system because you're spreading the same amount of fluid over more vessels. They're also larger lumen, okay? Since there are more of them and the blood is not rushing through them at any quick pace, comparatively speaking, they may at any moment contain up to 65% of your blood, and it's just kind of farting around on its way home from work. So let's look at the structure of a vein compared to an artery. Same three tunics, much less smooth muscle, much less elastic, generally a larger lumen for the same diameter of vessel. And as far as clinical connections, and we can talk about this in class a little bit, a varicose vein is when one has a weakness in the wall of a vein. It will make it balloon out. It can happen in the superficial veins of the leg. If there is a decent amount of pressure on the vein, the blood can get caught in the vein and make it balloon out, especially around the valves. And then hemorrhage is just when that occurs in the anal canal. Okay, so many veins have valves in them. And the way the valve would work is if the blood is moving up back toward the heart, let's say through a leg or an arm, up back toward the heart, the valve would be positioned this way so that if you got blood back past the valve, it would close the valve and it would prevent backflow. So really the function of a valve in veins is the same as the function of a valve in the heart, to prevent backflow, to prevent blood from going backward. Why do we not need valves in arteries? Well, the blood is such high pressure that backflow is not generally an issue. But if you have low pressure blood moving against gravity, sometimes it tries to go backwards, like in your legs. A vein that is rather large and thin-walled is called a sinus. And we have run into many sinuses so far, right? You've got one on the back of the heart. What's that called? Coronary sinus. You've got one right here under the sagittal suture. That one's called the superior sagittal sinus. You've got all of these sinuses related to blood flow in the brain, and we'll talk about those in just a second. So there's a whole bunch of sinuses. Not all sinuses, by the way, are veins, but since veins tend to have a larger lumen, they're more likely to be a vein than an artery. Okay, so we'll start circulatory routes next.